Very excited. I have with me my former colleague, of course, Dr. Rodney Howsare. All of my regular viewers know him, professor of theology and chair of the Department of Theology and Philosophy at DeSales University near Center Valley, Pennsylvania. But the guest of honor today is a dear and old friend of both Rodney and myself, Dr. Adrian Walker. And Dr. Walker is professor of dogmatics at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, which is near San Francisco. He used to teach, too, philosophy and theology at Catholic University of America's School of Theology and Religious Studies. He also taught at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family in Washington, D.C. And he also taught, I think, at the JP2 Institute, the Pontificio Instituto, Giovanni Paolo II.
Very good.
Per studi matrimonio e famiglia.
Bravo, bravo.
Yeah, bravo. Okay. In Rome, obviously.
Yes,
in
indeed.
Rome. He's also a polyglot of unbelievable skill and talent. Has translated many scholarly texts from German, Spanish, French, Italian. And I love how you just are so adept at not only doing scholarly things, but to even you translated, I think, the first volume of Pope Benedict's Jesus of Nazareth. Did you not?
I did do that, indeed.
Yeah, and you sort of kept the vitality of it, I thought. Not that my German is of a level to say, oh, Adrian really captured the vitality of Ratzinger's German. Thank God. Anyway. So plus he's also an editor at Communio in Washington, D.C., the American.
Yeah. What was? I've sort of I'm so busy kind of juggling other balls out here that I've had to downgrade my status to consulting editor. But I was pretty heavily involved in the journal for a long time and still
you've joined
recommend it very highly.
Rodney and I are both consulting editors.
Yeah, that's right.
Even though, and I think this is an indictment, I think it's a very personal assault. I haven't been consulted in a very long time. So it's like, well, we'll keep him on the books because he's an old friend, but don't send that guy anything.
So now you're an insulted editor rather than a consulting.
Oh, yeah. And boy, do I have an edge now. They better not send me anything now. But anyway, just kidding. We're very, very happy. Adrian did his doctoral thesis on Maximus the Confessor.
That's right.
At where? The Gregorian?
At the Gregorian, yeah.
At the Gregorian in Rome. He's also published all kinds of articles himself. So welcome, Dr. Adrian Walker. It's been a little bit of an ordeal managing all of our schedules.
It has.
He's out in California. It's always hard when I interview people. Like I interviewed Bishop Barron stuff out in California because of the time difference.
Yeah.
And Bishop Barron just been named bishop out in the.
I heard that yesterday. Yeah.
Promotion or demotion, I don't know, but God bless Bishop Barron and Godspeed. Anyway, we're gonna start off our questioning today. I don't have a scripted thing as usual.
I don't be
a free-flowing conversation.
Sure.
We're just going to let the Spirit move us, take us where we will.
Excellent.
Where we will. And so I've already warned Dr. Howsare that he's going to get the first question.
Okay.
So
can I just jump in really fast, Larry, just to say, thank you for having me on. I mean, it's a pleasure to see both of you guys whose friendship I treasure very much and whom I haven't been able to see much of because, I'm out here and you're out there. And one of you is really out there, but also because I just, as I was saying before we started recording, Larry, I just think the way that you've been sort of publicly present, the last couple of years through this venture, through your blog, through, the stuff that you do at Catholic World Report, sort of in addition to, your scholarship and as an extension of it really into the kind of more public forum, I think is really kind of exemplary.
Wow.
And it's just a pleasure to read your stuff. I mean, really, because it's sort of, it's very rare, that somebody can, in an analysis, unite a really precise, kind of fine-grained, precisely analysis with both the big picture and such humor. I mean, it's that you can combine all of that, and it's really it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So for me, it's just great to kind of,
Well,
also to participate a little bit in your venture here, your ventures.
Well, I thank you for those kind words, Adrian, and that means a lot to me. It's high praise coming from you, because you two are somebody that I hold in such high esteem, and I've held in high esteem since I met you, I think, for the first time in 1996 at Nikki
Lee's before Rodney was born.
Yeah. Maybe around Rodney's first communion. I don't know. That's right. Somewhere
you
around.
Still have the dress, right?
96. Yeah, he still has the dress. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've seen it. He's a regular J. Edgar Hoover.
Sorry, folks.
By the way, that's a joke.
Yes.
There's currently no evidence that Rodney does those things. So anyway, Rodney, well, thank you, Adrian. That really, sincerely, thank you.
No, thank you, and equally sincerely. Yeah.
Okay, so Rodney, get the ball rolling here.
Well, hey, this is fun. And we don't have anything planned, Adrian. I think Chapp sent me a text this morning and said, "What are we going to talk to Adrian about?"
I said, I don't have any questions. I just think it's kind of cool that we're talking to Adrian. So.
Well, I feel the same way. Yeah.
But anyway.
But I do have I think we could get this started. Chapp mentioned that you wrote your dissertation on Maximus, and I've known you forever, but I don't think we've ever really sat down at length and talked about Maximus that much. And so maybe just begin by talking about what you think sort of Maximus's ongoing significance is, for philosophy, for theology, for what's going on in the church right now, et cetera, et cetera.
That's as people always say when they don't know how to answer, they always say, "That's a great question."
Well, that buys you time. That's a really time.
That's a really great question, because I need to think for a minute about how to answer that. Well,
can I frame it for you a little bit, maybe?
What's that?
Let me frame Rodney's question a little bit to add my 2 cents in.
Sure.
It seems to me that almost all of the intractable debates that are currently going on in the church today, theologically, ecclesiologically, and otherwise, all boil down to problems in our understanding of the relationship between nature and grace, God and world. Mm-hmm. And thus, it would seem to me that the really profound contribution that Maximus the Confessor still has to make is in his understanding of Chalcedonian Christology.
Nice.
And of the relationship between the divinity and humanity of Christ, especially their wills. So
that's beautifully said, Larry. I think that's right. So maybe I should just preface my remarks by saying that, I wrote my dissertation on Maximus, and I've continued to read him, and I teach and to teach him as well. But I haven't really sort of kept up with the latest Maximus scholarship, which seems to be pretty abundant now. But I know you're not asked. That's not what you're asking about. But I should just tell people that, I know something about Maximus, of course, and I've been sort of meditating his stuff for a long time. But it's not that I'm some sort of big name Maximus scholar or something like that. I mean, I just want to make that clear. But or have some standing in the Maximus Guild or something like that. But
well, let's make a distinction. Let's make a distinction here. You're probably not the biggest name in Maximus scholarship, because there are, like you said, there's all these new books out there right now. But I would hold your views on Maximus as second to anybody else's. And
well, that thank you for saying that, Larry. Yeah, but again, I just want to. It's just truth in advertising, essentially, so that your viewers know that this is kind of I mean, just understand that I'm I'm not here as sort of, an internationally recognized Maximus scholar. Not that they would necessarily care about that anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think you put your kind of finger on the core of it. So I would just start by affirming what you said and sort of repeating it, that at the core of kind of all of these debates that are kind of seem to be tearing apart the church and even seem to be tearing apart our country, in one way or another, sort of reduce back to, profound disagreements, I guess, which maybe aren't really recognized as such, or recognized at all, about that fundamental question, the relationship between God and the world. And Maximus does have something to tell us about that question. And what he does have to tell us, or what he has to tell us, does have something to do centrally with the question of Christ's human action and volition. So maybe as kind of a way into unfolding that point a little bit, we could reframe the question about God and the world as a question about as a question about human freedom. It seemed to a lot of sort of modern thinkers and just to a lot of modern people in general that something like union with God or obedience to God would have to mean a truncation of human freedom. And Maximus, and of course, if you now, what's interesting is that it isn't just modern people who have thought that. Actually, the theological parties whom Maximus was combating in the 7th century, and who then came to be recognized as heretics by the church, also thought that union with God and obedience to God would truncate human freedom. It's just that they didn't think that was such a big deal. The moderns think it's a big deal, and so they want to get rid of God. And the heretics who Maximus was combating just sort of took it in their stride and thought that was sort of the price that you had to pay, and it was worth paying. So what Maximus does, sort of in response to that, is show that, first of all, that's not true, that obedience to God, union with God, doesn't truncate human freedom, doesn't truncate human nature either, but brings them to their flourishing, even as what they are in distinction from God. But what's really a sort of further point that's connected with that he helps us see is that if that weren't the case, then we wouldn't actually be dealing with the true God, because as Maximus says in certain passages, for example, of his disputation with Pyrrhus, which is a sort of probably I would guess a redacted transcript of a debate that Maximus actually was involved in with a former patriarch of Constantinople called Pyrrhus. So, for example, in certain passages of that work, but it's a thought that occurs everywhere. A God who wasn't able to assume humanity, not just in some sort of general or sort of partly committed way, but sort of all the way through to the point where, as man, he also was able to work and will our salvation in a very concrete way through a decisive action. That a God who wasn't able to do, who didn't do that, either wouldn't be all powerful or all good, or both.
Right.
So
right.
it's actually so really, in a way, the core intuition isn't even so much that we have to save the human, or this is the way of saving the human. It's first of all the goodness of God that's at stake, the goodness of the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, whose goodness would be obscured if the Son who represents him on earth and sort of enacts that representation as man didn't do it in such a way that his filial obedience also fulfilled his, as Maximus puts it, the logos of his nature.
Right.
That it's just there, right? So for example, in Gethsemane, and I think this is Maximus is absolutely a sort of faithful exegete of the synoptic accounts, especially Mark. I think. I mean, when I say that, I mean I see the greatest affinity between Mark and Maximus here. That shows himself to be a really sort of absolutely faithful and sensitive exegete of the synoptic accounts of Gethsemane. That it's precisely when the Lord Jesus, speaking as the Son he is, but as it were, in and through a truly human, free filial obedience. It's just then when he says, not my human will be done, but thy will be done, and says that as man with this sort of free filial and therefore free obedience. It's just then that the goodness of the Father shines forth most of all, as that which we're made to participate in and to reflect. And so, of course, if we're right, so we go back, we circle back, right? I mean, of course, if in that extreme moment, and just in that extreme moment, the goodness of the Father is revealed, then it's not going to truncate anything. And then that becomes a kind of a paradigm for understanding the kind of the relationship between God and the world. This is the kind of God we're dealing with, a God who will display his goodness precisely by catching us up as into that display as sort of co-agents of it, and in such a way that the kind of obedient filial dimension of the co-agency is not a slavish subjection, but is actually itself a perfection and actually a form of freedom, even understood as self-command.
Yeah. Good. Did you want to say something, Rodney? Because I have something I could say, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, well, maybe we can both kind of intersect.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just thought of something, Adrian, while you were talking.
Yeah.
Especially at the end, is you watch people parent, right? And and you got these little kids that are, they start getting quite willful, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And let's say you're trying to persuade them to sort of spend less time on their, video games or their devices or whatever, and maybe spend a little more time reading, studying for school or whatever. Right. And they're, of course, throwing a total fit. And
yes,
it's sort of interesting that it's precisely the parent, out of love for the child, that wants the child actually to begin to will what is good for the child.
Right.
It's not like the parent simply wants their own way, right? There's, I want you to study and you want a video game. I want my will to prevail. It's not even that. It's like you're not even a parent unless the kid actually begins to will what is actually good for the child, right? Because you know that's right. You know, and so I just thought of that little analogy a little, you know,
absolutely,
So that's
absolutely, No, that's beautiful, Rodney, and that's very much to the point, because the good that's willed is doubly good. It's good as something that is worth doing, and it's also good as something that's worth doing together. And that's the point. And if you focused only on the first aspect, say as a parent, or in this case of so as an earthly parent, or in this case of God the Father and his eternal child made man, living his sonship out on earth. If you focused only on the one aspect of this is a good thing to do, which is a very important aspect, and not to be, but I'm just saying, if you focused only on that and isolated it from the other one, you would drift pretty quickly into a sort of outcomes-based thinking. All that matters is the outcome. And of course, as the parent, the outcome is your outcome, right? It's the one you want. And so very quickly, the means become sort of indifferent, and it doesn't matter whether we do it together or not. It's just, all that matters is that it gets done, however, in any which way. And there is something kind of loveless about that, and something sort of, I mean, we were all joking before the before the recording started about sort of technocracy and so forth. And that's a very kind of technocratic way of thinking. As long as the sort of isolated outcomes that somebody has decided are important get sort of, as long as the targets are met, it doesn't matter what kind of delivery system you're using. It's really awful, actually.
Yeah, and that kind of gets at so it's nice. I can piggyback on that conversation. Gets at what was popping into my head as you were speaking so beautifully, Adrian. Is the thing that kept popping into my head is that for all of its talk of freedom, the modern world doesn't understand what freedom is, and actually doesn't want freedom, doesn't even want it. And that there's a difference between mere choosing a Big Mac over a Whopper and true freedom. The second thing is that I don't think modern Christians, Catholics in particular, perhaps, begin to fathom or appreciate deeply enough how important freedom in this spiritual sense is to the entire Christian economy.
Absolutely.
To the entire Christian concept of why we're here, what creation was, what salvation is for, and that this is precisely the Christian emphasis on freedom and historicity, and our embodiedness in that is precisely what the modern world hates. I think of Dostoevsky's great, the little chapter in the Brother Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor. What is the Inquisitor's main objection against Christ? Why he's bringing him up on charges? How dare you come back and re-emphasize and double down on the freedoms that you gave to people and expected from them after we had come along and sort of taken it all away from them.
Absolutely.
And we've infantilized them with bread and circuses and miracles. You've come back to de-infantilize them and re-emphasize how important freedom is to the entire Christian economy.
Yes.
So we were joking about technocracy and how I have mixed feelings about blogging and using all this technology, because in many ways I consider it to be the very expression of, in some way, of the effacing of the Christian evangel. I'm having, maybe you can help me articulate what it is I'm trying to say in that regard.
Well, I don't think you need any help. You just, I mean, once again, see, that's part of the reason that we're friends, is that we sort of recognize, the sort of the same intuitions and the same sort of style of thinking and the same questions. We sort of recognize those in one another, and that's actually, one of the reasons why we're friends and have been for quite a while now.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, so first of all, what you said about freedom was great. I wholeheartedly agree, and it occurred to me as you were talking that um, the sort of double goodness of the good to be done. It's good in itself, but it's also worth doing together. It's good to do together. Sort of indicates the sort of gestalt of freedom that you were pointing towards. So that it's of course it's not just sort of meaningless choice, but it's also not freedom is not a merely instrumental good at all, because it's
Right.
I mean, it's something, DC Schindler points out really nicely in different places, that, another friend of ours, that, it's right. It's easy to sort of react against the kind of, sort of, let's say, liberal reduction of freedom to a certain type of choice by saying, freedom is for the good, which of course is true, but the point we're trying to get at here is that there's a way that freedom, rightly understood, is also part of the good, and so it seems to me that this sort of double, two in one nature of the good to be done, the good to be loved, sort of gets at that, right? So there is a normative direction. Yeah. There is a good that's lovable in itself, but it's a common good. It's lovable for more than one. I mean, in fact, its lovability sort of calls for, us loving it together so once you say that, then at least implicitly, you're also saying that the fact that I'm involved and that you're involved actually matters.
Yeah.
And it matters so much that the fact that it does matter, right, sort of shows that yes, freedom has a kind of a normative direction, and if you want to think about it having a kind of instrumental value in that sense, that's sure, but it's also freedom is intimately bound up with our personal co-participation in the good, and this leads to another point, which is that, and I think I'm getting to your question
You are. Absolutely,
technology and stages, I hope, but this other point about that sort of what freedom is. I mean, it's interesting that Maximus, to go back to him, uses a term that's not unique to him, but that's sort of striking. He doesn't talk so much about freedom as about what he calls autexousia, which is a kind of self-command, actually.
Right.
And that's actually a dimension of freedom and of its sort of intrinsic belonging to that double good, which we have to be sensitive to. So we actually want there to be self-command. We actually want freedom understood as self-command, and that's the problem with the kind of liberal understanding of choice. So I'm getting to your point, right, about a sort of lack of freedom. That liberal freedom of choice is basically, in the end, a kind of poor substitute for self-command. Because I mean, for all kinds of reasons, but I mean, in part because, I mean, one reason is that you never gather yourself up into a kind of meaningful disposal over your whole life. And what Maximus is saying is that that kind of self-command, which actually is pretty radical, right? I mean, if you describe that self-command in a certain way, it could almost sound like some, I don't know, Nietzsche or something like that, right? But it's a pretty radical form of self-command. But what Maximus is saying is that that sort of self-command is inseparable from the co-participation in the good, which of course is inseparable from the intrinsic goodness of good as a kind of common good, is something that's therefore meant to be loved in common, co-participated in common. And the thing about, I mean, one of the things about technology, and this is just to get to your last point, which has been striking me a lot, and this is something that I really learned from Matthew Crawford, the author of Shop Classes Soulcraft, but also two other very fine books that sort of prolong and deepen the same project that he's carrying forward in Shop Class. That and in a way, it's a variation on your point, Larry, is that we're not agents enough. That in a certain sense, what technology is, among other things, is a kind of racket, which basically says, do you know, your own embodied agency is really, really inefficient. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to extract it from you. We're going to enhance it and make it perfect. And then we're going to give it back to you at a very reasonable price. The only problem is that even where it's actually true, although this is kind of doubtful if you're asking about net gain across the whole system. But let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that this gives you at your fingertips, puts at your fingertips more power than you would have had otherwise. The fact of the matter is that it's not really yours, because it's not actually inside of you. And it's also revocable, essentially at the will of the licensor. So you don't actually own the music on your iPod or whatever it is, your whatever, right? You don't actually own that. So actually, we don't have sufficient agency or a kind of even a proper sense of agency, and therefore we don't have any chance of having a real self-command. And this is but this is not unrelated to, and this is the last point, the sort of liberal understanding of freedom of choice, because part of that racket I was talking about is, and this is something George Grant points out in his essay, Thinking About Technology, part of the racket is creating more possibilities of a kind of concupiscent desire that is not a desire for anything that is actually able to give rest and satisfaction, is actually able to give self and also not able to give self-command. So you have a racket that does this kind of almost bait and switch with our agency, which is bound up with, and even to some extent, an expression of a kind of reduction of freedom of choice that actually, or of freedom to a kind of freedom of choice that actually deprives us of proper self-command. And so here we are, these moderns who are always talking, as you say, talking about freedom. And it turns out that this 7th century monk is able to out-freedom us. And he's able, even in a certain way, to out-Nietzsche, right, who's also a critic of sort of bourgeois liberal freedom, precisely by saying that the way to this kind of radical self-command is to be a son in the sun, and is to sort of follow in the footsteps of Christ, through Gethsemane and the cross to the resurrection. It's pretty phenomenal, actually.
Yeah.
Cool
Yeah,
stuff.
I've written somewhere in a couple places. I refer to your last point about concupiscence. I refer to our society as a collective of concupiscence,
That's right.
and you call it a racket. Balthazar might call it
Yeah.
the system, whatever. It goes by
Yes.
different names. I call it a
Yes.
collective of, and the thing
Yes.
is this: you've nailed it. The thing is, the modern liberal ordo and its conception of freedom is simply about a sort of, I like to say, it's a form of choosing that costs us nothing, and
Yeah.
therefore leads us to no true self-possession. Modern
Yeah.
freedom is about choosing in consonance with my concupiscible desires in a way that costs me the most minimal amount of expenditure of
Exactly.
energy. And that runs completely contrary to a Christian anthropology, because for
Precisely.
us, self-possession is self-dispossession. In fact, those two things are
Yes.
completely coincident with one another in a sort of
Precisely.
kenotic sense of what
Yeah.
all of this means. And therefore, there's no real choosing of any deep sort going on in the liberal
That's
order.
it.
And people, the thing is, my thing is, people understand this, which is
Yeah.
why it leads to depression and frustration. And I'm going to turn over to Rodney in a second. One last point where you said Maximus says, where you say Maximus out freedoms us. All
We
right.
have a new game. Maximus says,
And I take this actually to be a tremendously important point. And it goes to like de Lubac's drama of atheist humanism,
Yep.
John Paul's humanism.
Yeah.
And it also goes to why it is that we do indeed have to engage modern philosophy and modern culture,
Absolutely.
because we have a deeper message. The goal is not to simply say, oh, those moderns, they're just simply all wrong. The
Exactly.
goal is to take what they're saying, invert it, hollow it out from within, and say, here's a
Yep.
better, you've got this emphasis on freedom. You don't know what freedom is. Here's real freedom.
No,
And
Larry, once again, I mean, that's so well said. And I just want to highlight only one thing for the sake of completeness, but which you said, which is that it isn't what we're not saying choice is bad and we have this other version of freedom where there's no choice. We're saying
yeah,
because you don't because your account of freedom undermines self-command, it also undermines choice.
Yeah.
So in other words, the liberals don't even understand what choice is, because there's something about, well, I mean, in other words, what's at stake in choice, right? People might think, well, what's at stake is I'm torn between good and evil, and that seems wrong-headed. But it has something to do with, let's say, choice between different goods, or the field of choice is sort of like the difference is the sort of option between good and evil. No, it has something to do,
right.
Yes, with sort of various goods that can't all be realized at the same time. But the point is that the sort of miracle, and we all know this from our own lives, exactly like you said, is that sometimes just that option of sort of one finite thing over others can be a way of bringing to light the significance of everything, including your whole life in relation to everything, and therefore enacts a kind of radical self-command, right? It's just that you can't do that unless, and unless there is a kind of teleological ordering to freedom, and unless there's a sort of the other aspect of the good is something that's to be loved together, because that togetherness also, among other things, sort of opens a door for a kind of a kind of hierarchically structured community in which there can be exercises of command and obedience that actually enable that sort of choice to happen. You know, I mean, whether it's in a religious community, whether it's getting married, whether it's, you know, even making important career decisions. I mean, all of those in some way or another, I'm thinking, require some kind of hierarchized co-willing or co-loving of the good, which is sort of essential to the actual kind of concrete form of the teleological ordering towards it. You know, without which it's just. I mean, the fact of the matter is that that motion and action and efficient causing just are end seeking. If you take away a pre-given end, you can't get started. You can't get started. It's as simple as that. Right? So it can't just be so. And that's the point about choice is that there's a kind of givenness to the situation of choice, and a lot of us actually resent that because we would prefer, you know, again, another sort of DC Schindler theme, we would prefer the fantasy of infinite possibility over over the sort of necessity of, you know, the actual options on the table. It's just that's getting it backwards, because even though there are certain circumstances in which we're kind of painted into a corner and none of the options is that great, we all know that. The kind of paradigmatic situation of choice isn't really like that. It's much more, I think, the kind of thing where, again, in the sort of finite actuality of the given situation, which is just a kind of snapshot of a kind of film that's about getting to the ends, you know, the ends. That the miracle is that within that there's a kind of participation in infinity and eternity. So much so that there could even be a kind of a sort of in some I mean, in at least maybe the paradigmatic circumstances, a kind of sense that you're actually transcending the sort of mere necessity of the given, and sort of almost participating kind of playfully in you know, bringing that very givenness about. I mean, there could be circumstances where that could happen, but again, you know, this is all just a way of saying that it's kind of, and again, I think we're all on the same page here, and you know, a lot of people that are kind of in our larger community of conversation, it's very much the sense that right, on the one hand, the tradition, the kind of pre-modern tradition, has implicit in it all these riches, and we're just trying to draw them out. And that one of the things that, you know, the modern guys whom we like Balthasar and Ratzinger, et cetera, do is not just invent a bunch of new stuff, but actually help us in that kind of sort of infiltrating dialogue with modernity that you were talking about, draw out those implicit riches. Right, which is very different from a sort of project of liberal theology, which is sort of like, well, you know, Orthodox Christianity, we tried that, but it's so exclusive, and so now let's just kind of reinterpret Christianity as the sort of chaplaincy to whatever the latest, apparently, supposedly universalistic emancipatory project is, you know. So let's all fly our rainbow flag or whatever in front of our church, you know. It's very different.
Yes.
Well, it is Pride Month. So there you go.
Yes, I call it.
I should have had a rainbow flag covering up Dorothy and Peter back there. So
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we could call it Pride Month cometh before a fall, or Pride cometh before a fall month, or something like
Yeah,
that. That is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
lot. That wouldn't
Anyway,
market.
sorry. I mean, this is part of that my problem is that I I've always needed a lot of time to kind of unfold things, and the problem is the older that I get, the more I feel entitled to that time, and so I'm always cutting people off, and I've noticed that I've been interrupting people too much lately, and I really need to
No,
work on that. It's not a
I consider that to be a virtue, and
no, it's not.
it's a virtue, and
Guest of honor, after all. Yeah.
I've developed that. I cut Howsare off all the time. Way back in the day when we were teaching together.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had some fun. Anyway, Rodney, question.
No, I just a follow up on some of that. I was just reading. I did an independent study with one of my better students that I've ever had, actually, this semester, and we did an independent study on Flannery O'Connor.
Oh yeah.
And we read both Wise Blood and The Violent Buried Away.
Mm.
And it's amazing, especially in Wise Blood, it's more obvious. Is that precisely, the two main characters, Hazel Motes and Enoch Emery, are both in search of freedom.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and the guy that gets ignored in all this is Enoch Emery, because Hazel Motes is such a character; he's the main character.
Right.
But Enoch Emery is so typical of what you were saying, Adrian, about modern freedom. Like, we boast about the fact that we have more choice and all this stuff. But the poor guy is powerless, utterly powerless against his just drives.
Yeah.
Like, he wants to save money for something. I forget what he's saving money for. Absurd. But he wants to save money, and he walks past the movie theater and all the flashing lights, and he smells the popcorn, and he's got the change in his pocket, and he's telling himself, I'm not going in there, I'm not going. And then he walks up and drops his money, gets the popcorn, and all of his money's gone. And,
that's right.
And so what's interesting is he throughout the story envies animals. Yeah. Because everything that an animal sort of needs to be is built in. It's sort of automatic. Yeah. Like, there's no squirrels that fail at being squirrels, right? So the guy envies the crap out of this animals, and he's all, it's like the whole thing's really funny. But she's so brilliant that she sees that. That's it. The very paradox that you said, or the irony, I guess is the word, is that we think we have a better understanding of freedom. I know. We celebrate freedom more. But we are, I mean, it's just obvious that our poor students are absolute slaves. Totally. I mean, they're all Enoch Emery,
No, Rodney, no, that's exactly right. And it's, again, I love these conversations because things become clear because of what the other people say. And you sort of like, but this obviously connects with, this question about God and the world, right? And, because also one of the stories, I was thinking this morning, modernity is the belief in the absolute novelty of modernity, and that's really the core of it. And it's just not true, we would tell ourselves, it's sort of like everybody on CNN and, all of the culture managers, as my, anyway, Caitlin Johnstone, she's kind of she's a sort of far left commentator who's actually pretty interesting about some of the stuff going on. She talks about the empire managers, right? The empire managers would probably all think that, God and all of that we, been there, done that. That's over. It'd be kind of nice to have some of that meaning and faith, but we can't. It's over. But the fact of the matter is that this liberal, or whatever you want to call it, understanding of freedom as the unrestraint of endlessly multiplying concupiscent desires is not just a sort of really, really, really shoddy knockoff of the real thing. But it's also a way of answering the question about the hunger of the human heart for the infinite.
Yeah.
So there we are, right? I mean, the very same question that, Maximus, answered so beautifully, or at least helps us think about, if if you could talk about answering a question like that, it's right in the middle of our culture, and the only problem is that the official narrative of the culture prevents us from seeing that question is at the heart of the culture, because what we've been told is that we live in an absolutely new circumstance. But like I say, the belief that modernity is the belief in the absolute novelty of modernity. It's completely self-referential,
right.
and it's all about trying to make that belief a self-fulfilling prophecy by the most stupendous, and this in a way is new. It's not absolutely new, but it's new in some sense. The most stupendous application of violence the world has ever seen.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So very true. It reminds me a lot of the analysis of modernity of Augusto del Noce.
Yeah.
By the way, I say this every time I mention his name. I wish my name was Augusto del Noce. You can call me Augusto del Noce all you want. It just flows off the tongue. But anyway, Augusto del Noce makes that point, that modernity is wedded to this idea very much, that it's sort of, there's a point to history and it's us. And we're a radical break with everything that came before.
Precisely. Which,
of course, his point is this is why modern philosophy has to engage in this periodization scheme where, where it's all very progressive from infancy into adolescence into adulthood. And now we're adults. And it's the religion of modernity is scientism and technocracy.
That's right.
So you get the whole point. But as he points out, of course, none of this is true. And scientism is a grand perversion of science as such, in a sense of questing after things,
right?
And that science and our culture need not have progressed in the way that it actually did.
Yes, that's right.
And the fact that it did progress in the way that it did, since it's not rooted in anything necessary, as they would imply, is a choice.
That's right.
Modernity is a choice.
Exactly.
We chose to go down this path.
Yes, that's right.
Which is why you began by mentioning the commentator who says, well, we can't, it'd be nice to have all these faith bits, but, we're beyond that. We can't do this anymore. So Del Noce says modernity can be defined by the following statement. We can no longer hold the following, or it's no longer possible to hold the following.
That's excellent. Yeah.
That's our dogma.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And, and it's I mean, of course there's also, I mean, so given what we were saying earlier about self-command and so forth, of course there's something new about each real action and even each proper choice, right? There is something new that absolutely can't be reduced exhaustively back to outside influences. That's true, right? And so the sort of revolutionary self-mystification of modernity is plausible in part, or seems plausible to many people, in part because there is something sort of gratuitous about choice, right? At the same time, there's also something necessary about the situation in which choices concretely present themselves. And again, in a way I'm repeating myself, but a sort of adequately lucid account of freedom would not only hold those two aspects together, but would show their integration. So I was talking about it in terms of finite and infinite before, but the similar structure and the relation between necessity and gratuity. Yeah. And it seems like you could sort of read again the kind of modern/liberal, I know we're jumbling terms, but together, but the sort of modern/liberal project, which is sort of scientistic, to use that language, but also political in a kind of inextricable mixture. We could look at it precisely as a way of trying to resolve the apparent mutual exclusion of those two things, of the gratuity and of the necessity involved in choice, by saying that what we're going to do is minimize, to the extent possible, the constraining power of given situations. Yeah. And we're going to then in a way turn the as much as possible what's given into a potential object of a sort of gratuitous choice, where gratuity is understood as a kind of explosion from below, which then ends up being, Enoch Emery, and
That's right.
Yeah. But then also the sort of like so a kind of multiplication of a seeming expansion of the ability to desire or choose in that particular way, right? But again, that's just the wrong way to. That's really the wrong way to kind of make the synthesis, or to sort of see the synthesis. It really has to be, like you were saying, Larry. It occurs to me that the point about so first of all, that the necessity aspect, of course, it can often be very uncomfortable for us. Again, especially if you yourself paint yourself into a corner where every option is bad. I mean, you can do that to yourself. Or I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. What do you do, right? But again, the thing is, that necessity itself, that's bound up with the finitude, is not evil. It's actually a good, right. For one thing. But then the second thing is that there's that part of its goodness consists precisely in making us go out of ourselves, canonically and also erotically. Those two things go together, so that within sort of in giving ourselves over to the sort of good constraints, we achieve a transcendence that's not just a negation of their givenness. Yeah. That's not just a repudiation of their givenness. Yep. And so you would have a kind of coming to light, of a sort of superior gratuity, but through, a kind of erotic and kenotic self-outpouring, just like you were saying, because you would see a trace of the good even in the fact that the situation of choice involves a kind of necessitation by the situation with respect to the chooser, because the chooser doesn't get to determine all the cards that are dealt, right? And our thing is like, no, that's not fair, and I need to have all these other options. Okay, fine. I mean, you could spend all eternity, multiplying the options. You're never really going to get out of that situation. So why not just deal with it the first time around, and then discover that that's the narrow gate that leads to, this vast opening. Yeah,
absolutely. That is so well put. Yeah. Rodney, I have something to say, but you have something.
No, I mean, no, I don't want to try to follow.
You know, this is the first time in history you've ever been mute. Come on. I've never known you to be mute. But anyway, I'm not mute. I want to shift gears just a little bit. I mean, we're running up on about an hour. For processing purposes, I don't like to go too much beyond an hour.
That's a good idea. No, I've been in meetings all day too myself, so I'm happy to.
I have a very a good friend, priest friend, Father Harrison Eyre. He runs a podcast called Clerically Speaking. I've had him on this show actually a few times. He's written a great book, Mysterion. But the reason why I bring him up is he's working on a doctoral dissertation right now on Joseph Ratzinger.
Oh, wow.
He's a Canadian priest from the Diocese of Victoria out near Vancouver. And his thesis is on, and it really strikes me as an extremely important point, is not unrelated to what we're talking about. His thesis is on the ontological mediation of being via time and history.
Nice.
In the thought of Ratzinger.
Nice. Yeah.
Just do you have any good stuff you want to riff on that topic, Adrian?
Oh boy, that's so great. I mean, I know other people in our circles have been thinking about that. You know, Rachel Coleman has been thinking about that in terms of matter and the importance of accidents. You know, both Hanby and Schindler have thought a lot about, you know, time and eternity and all of that. And I mean, you guys, and you know, so I mean, it's not as if you know, I'm so they're right, but you're not interviewing them, right? You're interviewing me. Okay, but yeah, I mean, this is something that maybe maybe is sort of a thought that's been kind of nurtured a little bit in dialogue with Rachel Coleman, whom you guys should have on your show.
We should have Rachel, if you're listening.
Yeah, I doubt she's listening, but I'll tell her she got a shout out on this.
Does Rachel ever listen to anything? That's the deeper
only the important things, Larry. The important things, you know. So
for my viewers, Rachel Coleman, former student of Rodney's and mine at DeSales University, got her PhD at the Institute in Washington D.C. Adrian knows her well.
Yes.
She now teaches at a college up in Massachusetts.
Yes. Assumption.
I don't want to.
Yeah. In Worcester.
But let me ask you.
Yes. But so I was going to answer, but go ahead. Go ahead.
The reason why I want to talk about this is, I mean, there are accusations out there by nitwits. And by nitwits, I mean people like Archbishop Crazoid Vigano, who flat out says, well, we can dismiss Ratzinger. He's a Hegelian. And this strikes me as, once again, part of the problem that we confront so often. Eduardo Echeverria, a theologian who teaches at Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit, sent me just recently a great little quote from Jean-Luc Marion.
All right.
I'm not always a huge fan of, but his latest book, the title escapes me. But in the quote, Marion makes the following point, which is, modern Christians who truly want to evangelize the world out of charity must cultivate their intellects.
Yeah.
We must be intelligent.
Yes.
We cannot be sentimentalized, emotive piles of goo. We have to confront. So in other words, so Ratzinger bothers to read and study Bonaventure. He bothers to actually take modern German notions of historicity seriously. And for that, he gets accused of being a Hegelian by now this burgeoning sort of red trad movement.
Yeah, but see, okay, so first of all, there is, I think it has to be acknowledged, a legitimate concern on the part not only of the rad trads, but of you know, the sort of good, you know, representatives of the sort of new Thomistic revival that you know, the way history has been handled in 20th century theology has been disastrous, because it basically ends up meaning everything's up for grabs, you know, everything's flux and all of that, and that's disastrous.
I'm going to interrupt you now, which is this: who could dare accuse Ratzinger of thinking that way?
No, I agree. I just want to make it clear that we're not being one-sided here, and that
Right.
So we see the problem, right? We see the problem.
Yeah.
But I think it's a mistake to sort of assume that these bad takes on historicity have a monopoly on the notion of history.
Yes,
exactly.
This is the point. Okay, so now this leads to, at least by my associative logic, to another point, which is now I'm starting to get closer to unfolding a little bit about on this topic. There's a big difference between between taking seriously a modern thinker and being held captive.
Yeah.
And I just think, as a matter of fact, it's not true that Ratzinger is held captive. I mean, Ratzinger has an incredible freedom of spirit, which comes in part from his serene rootedness in Catholic tradition. So what's going on? What's he doing? Well, I think what he's doing is exactly, he's doing an example of what we were talking about a few minutes ago, namely, sort of drawing out of the tradition and even of the deposit of faith into a kind of greater explicitness, truths that actually help us to do what you just said even earlier, which is, you use this language of sort of getting outside, hollowing out. It's kind of like in the Alien movie, right? We're going to explode out of the chest of, of Hegel. And so why is this an important project? Well, it's an important project for the following reason. While it is true that there is an ineliminable and good and beautiful propositional dimension, not only to dogma, but also to revelation itself, okay, such that it's absolutely possible to formulate something that is sort of true for all time. I mean, that's just a given. It's also true that that dimension, that sort of propositional and conceptual dimension, can't be separated from and probably can't be maintained all the way through without an attention to another dimension of revelation, which is that it happened in stages.
Yeah.
Now, so think about it like this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, imagine that you were looking back on your life, and you were sort of trying to sum up the wisdom that you'd learned in your life in a few propositions. You could absolutely do that. It's a great thing to do, in fact, especially if they're propositions that contain some wisdom that you can actually pass on to the next generation. But then suppose that you said, really all that mattered is that I got these propositions. The fact that I got to them by living with, my wife, by having children, by overcoming cancer, in short, by being led providentially from one finite situation to the next. It's just a delivery system. Yeah, and if I had been God, I would have just given me the propositions at the beginning, and I would have spared me, poor me, all of the mess, right? I think we would all intuitively realize that there's something missing there, right? Similarly with revelation, absolutely, there's a propositional conceptual dimension, and not just the rad trads, but the sort of, the sort of interesting and intelligent people that are kind of leading the new Thomistic revival, I mean, I think they would be very sensitive to, among other things, that dimension, and rightly so, But the problem is acting like everything else is just basically fungible scaffolding and delivery system. And the problem with that is that then you'd back yourself into, okay, so the Exodus, just basically a kind of illustration of a lesson that we could have gotten some other way. The incarnation should maybe God should have just dropped a book out of heaven like he supposedly did on in Islam, and so on and so forth. And then but then you have to start thinking, okay, but then wait a minute. If that separation were possible, that means that the propositional content and the propositional / conceptual dimension would only refer accidentally to the history.
Yeah.
But then why do we think then that we could have a binding statement about the ontological constitution of Christ?
Yeah.
Right? Because if you can't talk about the ontological constitution of Christ without talking about his humanity as something that is not just
static
as to its right. It's not just complete sort of on the level of the essence of the nature, but as Maximus says, is also complete on the level of energy, of operation and of volition and of action. So in other words, basically, you end up saying that you end up essentially denying that the flesh is the hinge of salvation. You end up denying the reality of the incarnation.
Yep.
And therefore, paradoxically, you deprive the propositions of one of their chief reference. Right?
Yeah.
Because it's not as if we're only concerned about the ontological constitution of Christ, but we're not actually concerned about Christ.
Yeah.
And ironically too, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it would seem to me that this actually feeds right in then to the modernist crisis, which
it does
a sharp distinction between the symbol and the reality
that's the point, right? So we have a dichotomy.
Yep.
And both sides agree that eternal truth and providentially unfolding action are not in any interesting way intrinsically connected at all.
Yeah.
And it's just that the kind of people who would maybe be sort of one-sidedly critical or sort of one-sidedly affirming of the propositional and conceptual, but would sort of be suspicious about the historical, the kind of extreme version of that is at least they hold on to the doctrines, but the form of thinking actually shares a really important presupposition with liberalism.
Yeah. That's good.
Rodney, go ahead. We're running out of time. Rodney, are you still mute, or do you have some final words?
No, it's maybe some last. First of all, we just started channeling kind of Blondel a little bit at the end there.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention Blondel, so go ahead. Yes.
No, I just thought I'd throw that out there. But I often, kind of when I was younger, studying the Bible, I was an evangelical or borderline fundamentalist, I guess, and I was always so struck by the fact that, I was like, why didn't Jesus just tell the disciples that the Gentiles were going to be included and that they didn't have to be circumcised?
Right.
Because he could have just said, hey guys, by the way, before I ascend into heaven, I've got these 40 days with you. I'm going to just tell you one thing. It's going to be a big problem going forward.
Exactly.
They don't have to be circumcised. But obviously he could have done that theoretically.
Well, that's it.
But why not?
Well, that's it. And
yeah.
and see, part of this is because persons matter.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, it matters that Peter was Peter.
Right.
That's actually theologically significant. Just like it matters that this guy that walked around Palestine was actually the Son of God. Was this particular was that person? You know.
Yep.
But you know, I just wanted to say when I mentioned Rachel before. I mean, that, you know, this is something that I think she's kind of working on a more sort of metaphysical level with Ulrich, you know, Ferdinand Ulrich, the German, 20th century German philosopher. I'm saying this for the benefit of the people in Radio Land. I know that you guys know who Ulrich is, but is that the way that the sort of created act of being, you know, that Aquinas calls esse, right, doesn't stand on its own, but has to be received and sort of, as Aquinas even says, you know, sort of compacted and limited to a finite essence, which in this physical world is going to be the essence of a corporeal thing.
Running doesn't run. Running doesn't run. Only runners. Right?
Running, right? Exactly. And in this world, they're runners with actual physical legs. You know. And that I think one of Rachel's sort of points that she's developing sort of in dialogue with Ulrich is that even though you can't say that being as such is physical, otherwise there'd be no metaphysics. Right. You have to say that you can say, in fact, you have to say that the fact that created esse, as it were, has to be in this world, in the world of corporeal things, has to be sort of received by not just a substance, but a corporeal substance, you know, a physical thing, a body in the end, right? A bodily being. That actually does say something about the meaning of the not only the fact that created esse doesn't subsist, right? It helps us understand that non-subsistence has a kind of positive significance. And what's that positive significance? It's that created esse is a kind of, as Aquinas says, right, it's a similitude of the divine goodness, which is a thought that comes from Dionysius the Areopagite, who talks about being as a procession of the good, right? And so that it's not that you just import, right? It's not that you just import the physical, or, you know, in this context of history, the temporal, right into being as such. It's that you see that the sort of, as it were, reception of being, and therefore subsistence, and therefore expression of the exercise of being, in a form, in a package that includes spatial extension or topical extension and duration and time, actually reveals something that's metaphysically significant, all the way up to the point where God is giving the act of non-subsisting being as an expression of his goodness, right? Now, again, this is all, I mean, you know, I'm just basically repeating something. This is something that Rachel is working on, and so I'm you know, very much attributing this to her, but saying that this is something that I think is a kind of good sort of complement to the kind of more sort of scripturally or sort of fundamental theological approach that I took a minute ago, which and in a way, I think this is the way forward, is that the sort of attention to the kind of temporal and narrative form of scripture and of sort of revelation in general that made sort of de Lubac and company ask searching questions about,
oh yeah,
you know, the sort of other approach. Not only has to be interpreted in the way that I did, I think, but it also has to be wedded to this metaphysical approach that I was just talking about, so that you can really come up with a very precise account of the way in which the historical, I mean, that is to say, the sort of unfolding of things over time, while it doesn't as such just get transported into eternity as such, so that everything gets mingled together, or eternity time. Nonetheless, it reveals something about the nature of eternity itself, such that again, what happens in time, the sort of historical, you know, providentially governed unfolding of things, is not irrelevant to the kind of timeless doctrinal, conceptual, propositional content, which is absolutely something we want to hold on to, I think. Otherwise, Calvinism is not true anymore.
Yeah,
because you know, because somebody woke up in 1965 and said, you know what, you know,
that's man, that you've just in 10 minutes encapsulated just some mind-blowing stuff. Balthasar talks about this as well. You know, God is not so much atemporal as supratemporal, and so on. You know, and I'd love to unpack it more, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Adrian, I could talk to you forever on all kinds of things,
and hopefully we will.
Well, yeah.
No?
Well, Rodney and I are going to be in at your place in Menlo Park in November, right?
That's going to be tremendous. Yeah, it's going to be so great to have you guys out here.
Yeah,
it's
going to be fun.
I ardently long for the day, you know, because you guys are just two of the best people that I know, and
well, thank you, and
two of the most likable people I know. On top of it, you know,
and
being and appearing, kind of our you know, beautiful unity and distinction here.
Anyway. Give our best to Margaret Turek. We're going to be interviewing her on the 20th on her book on the Atonement. So anyway, hey, thanks everybody for watching. Sorry for the few internet glitches, but hopefully they weren't too bad. Talk to you soon.
Thanks everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Goodbye.